We are back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us. Clint Kelly, malpractice attorney, is here with us this morning. It's good to have him on. 737-7587 if you'd like to join in the conversation. And as I said, malpractice attorney, standard of care. Just curious, as we sit here right now, a lot of it around the Vought case, but maybe someone's watching that and realizing I had a situation, maybe not quite to that level. What are you seeing these days in the malpractice world? Tort law and everything else.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, and it's a little depressing actually for me, is, Tennessee passed the COVID liability. It's an immunity bill that immunizes hospitals and doctors if they're treating a patient who has COVID. Any bad outcome from that treatment, you have to prove recklessness by clear and convincing evidence, or else the claim is barred. Which is, it's like having to prove what Nurse Vought did, that level. Otherwise, you're not going to have a remedy. That law is being, in my opinion, misused or misconstrued to cover situations where the patient comes in with a condition that's mismanaged, but because there was concern the patient had COVID, or maybe the patient tested positive for COVID, but the COVID had nothing to do with the patient's death. The hospital and the doctor are saying we're immune from liability even though we mismanaged this patient's case and the patient was injured or died. We haven't had a case go up to the Court of Appeals yet, but these cases are going to be making their way up the track to see how far can the healthcare providers extend this COVID immunity to their care of patients. Even when COVID had nothing to do with what happened to the patient, they want to say if COVID had any relevance whatsoever to the treatment, they get immunity. I don't think that was the intent of the legislature.
Right, I don't think that was the intent at all.
But that's not the point. The point is, can they get some judge?
They're going to go with it.
Yeah, sure. Can they get a judge to agree with it? And it could take down some meritorious cases where a patient or family should be compensated, but the healthcare providers get the benefit of the COVID immunity bill, and then there's no compensation.
Now, when we talk about what the intent of the legislation was, what do you perceive that to be? I mean, the fact that there were so many cases, COVID was relatively new. Early on, maybe as we didn't know that much, maybe some mistakes were honestly made that could have been done differently, and you shouldn't be held responsible for that because of the nature of this new illness?
Yeah, I think the intent of the legislation was that we were going to protect healthcare providers when they were treating COVID if there was a bad outcome from that treatment, because at the time the law was passed, there was even some disagreement from the CDC about how it was supposed to be managed. You got all this ivermectin, and hydrochloroquine, and all these different, I can't pronounce the name of the drugs, but you remember all that time where people were just reaching, for whatever they could get. I think that was the intent of the legislation. I don't believe the intent was that if the patient if there was any relevance to COVID and COVID had nothing to do with the injury, that the healthcare providers would still be protected. The law doesn't even say that. One thing though, Nick, that law is still in effect today. I mean, we now know how to treat COVID. We know how to deal with it, and yet that law is still in effect.
Is it perpetual now, or is it going to sunset at some point? I mean, that should not be on the books 2 years from now as we make our way, unless there's some